it was always clear what Tear Fund would be about. After all, the R in Tear stands for relief, and a fund, well, you know what a fund is. So they were always going to be involved in providing relief to people who were caught up in natural disasters. And so for the last 56 years, they have been providing food and shelter to people experiencing natural disasters. And what is more, staying with them in the process of trying to build back. But you notice too that in that clip, it started with the concept of poverty. And that's because there is a link between natural disasters and poverty. When struck by natural disasters, very often people say, we lost everything. The land's been flooded, we can't use it. All the things we had to make a living have gone. We have nothing at all. And conversely, when natural disasters come, it hits those in poverty hardest of all. They have the least ability to ride it. So, although disaster relief is the main thrust of Tear Fund, for the last 40 years or so, they have been involved in the search for the elimination of poverty, particularly extreme poverty. What they've been looking for, because the E in Tear Fund stands for evangelical, is looking for a gospel message that is, in the words of Jesus, a gospel which is good news for the poor. What would such a gospel message look like? Well, I think it would, first of all, speak to the spiritual and physical needs of the one who receives the gospel account. It would transform them and would remove them out of poverty. What's more, it would give them a voice, and then, well, they would see that they were part of the solution. So, how do Tear Fund set about this? Well, as you saw in the clip, it involves churches, and they have been involved with some 25,000 churches in a program which they call Church and Community Transformation. It's church-based. That's the unit they work with fundamentally. And the process begins with Bible study. They look at particular Bible stories. This enables people to think again about the nature of God, what he's truly like. And then they start to think about themselves. How does God see them? And in light of these two understandings, they then look at their particular situation and perhaps see it in a quite different light. So, what sort of stories? Well, one obvious one is the feeding of the 5,000. You know it well. It's a story which I would classify as the impossible task. We can't get out of poverty. It's impossible. It's beyond us. In the feeding of the 5,000, you remember that at the end of the day, the disciples say to Jesus, send the people away. There's no food around here. We're miles from anywhere. Send them home. If they've got a long way to go, then they can get some food. And Jesus challenges them by saying, you feed them. This is the impossible task, which the disciples instantly recognize. No, that's impossible, they tell him. There's no food for miles, and even if there was, we don't have the money to buy it. It's quite impossible. And Jesus promptly comes back and says, well, what do you have? What food is there? This, to quote Henry, is what is in your hand. And so, very shortly, we find Jesus blessing the packed lunch of one little boy. He gives it to the disciples, and they begin to distribute it. A first serving. Remember, there are 5,000 men, not to mention women and children. Second round. Thirds, you're still hungry? Have some more. And finally, they collect up everything, and there's more than they started with. This is divine mathematics. You take what was in their hand, and God, through his power, multiplies it. So in the end, there is enough and more. Okay. So how effective is this sort of process? Well, Tearfund have brought in external examiners, analysers, people who are usually used by the government, because when the government gives money to third world projects, it always wants to know what the return is, so it can justify its expenditure. So it brings in people who are professionally engaged in assessing how effective projects are. And their estimation is that for every pound that is put into this process of church and community transformation, the outcome in terms of social value is about £28. Now, I would sort of dispute that. I would have thought the longer you wait, the bigger is the multiplying factor, basically. For example, if you were to take one family out of poverty, what would be the result? Well, I think you'd have to look down several generations to actually work out what the result was. However, let's take their data. A short while ago, a few weeks ago, Tearfund was given £250 by this church. It's part of its mission giving. And it happened that that was just at the time when supporters of Tearfund said, whatever is given, we'll double it. We'll match it. So our 250 is now 500. And if that is put into CTT, which I think it inevitably would be, it gets multiplied by 28. So our giving is now worth about £14,000 worth of social impact. Interesting. Churches, I think, tend to sign up for this program. They see the effect that it has on a neighbouring church and say, we want in on that. 25,000 churches to date. Their vision for Tearfund is that it will be 250,000. That's a tenfold increase to be achieved by 2030. What they're looking for is divine mathematics, the same multiplying process. Basically then, churches come into the process as a sort of bottom-up process. They see what's going on and want to join. Not that Tearfund are above dealing with the people at the top of the organisation to get their support. They very recently decided that they wanted to bring CTT process into the Middle East. And so they organised that all the heads of the different denominations there should get together. Now, it's difficult sometimes to get all the people in the PCC together on the same day. Now, you try and get the Archbishop of the Catholic Church and the Archbishop of the Orthodox Church and the head of the Pentecostal Church and two other big churches they have there in the Syria area, which I don't even know about. Try and get them together for an afternoon. Well, Tearfund got them together for a week, and they sent them to Kenya. It was go and see this process in action. Go and talk to the people who've gone through it. One interesting thing happened on that journey. One of these dear archbishops, I can't remember which, but it doesn't matter, say it was the Catholic one, had an accident and was forced to go in a wheelchair. Well, a wheelchair requires somebody else to push it. And it turns out this fell to the job of one of the other archbishops, the Orthodox, shall we say. And so all week, these two were bonded together. They went and saw the different churches. They saw what was happening. They talked about it. They looked after each other. And so it was the two were totally bonded by the end of the week and went back to Syria. And both of them encouraged their congregations to look carefully at this project. So, it seems to be very effective. It looks like it's going to grow and spread. Its aim, as far as Tear Fund is concerned, is the removal entirely of extreme poverty. There will always be some poverty. It's always relative, of course. There are always some who have less than others. What I want to do now is actually show you the process by actually looking at a couple of these Bible stories that they use. I mentioned the one, two more will do. For this to be effective, you have to use your imagination. You have to imagine that you are in extreme poverty. You're never sure you're going to eat on any one day. It's always been like that. It was like that for your parents and grandparents and in your upbringing it's been like that. You've often gone to bed without food. Brothers or sisters pass away through malnutrition. It's a hard grind. And the future is just the same prospects. With that in mind, let's look at the two stories. The first one we'll deal with is the raising of Lazarus. Interesting story. Well, how should we classify that? It's not the impossible task. It's more the hopeless situation. And as someone deep in poverty, that's how you would look at life. It's a hopeless situation. I'm never going to get out of this. It's all beyond us. Well, back to the story. You remember that Jesus and all his disciples turn up at the house of Mary and Martha. They turn up shortly after Lazarus has died. In fact, 4 days after he has died. By now, Lazarus, his body has been placed in a cave, in a tomb, and the entrance to this cave has been sealed. Big rock in front of it, piles of rocks, some wooden structure, don't know what it is, but it's sealed. And he's been in there 4 days. The 4 days is significant. The feeling amongst Jews at the time was that by the 3rd day, the soul had certainly left the body. Any chance of recovery was gone. This was indeed, for the grievers, a hopeless situation. Jesus turns up, and his first remark is, "Open up the tomb." And Martha says, well, she wrinkles her nose and says, "I don't think that's a good idea." Actually, she said something a lot stronger and to the point, but we'll give her a bit of grace. But Jesus comes back at her straight away. "Did I not tell you that if you believed, if you had faith, if you trusted, you would see the power of God?" Well, there are lots of people around, and so the opening up of the tomb is done. There is a huge rock, lots of people to push and lever. If it's piles of stone, they move them away, and so on. At this point, Jesus, you remember, decides to pray. He's not particularly serious about praying. He's trying to get a message over to those who are all around, who are observing what's going on. He prays, "Father, I thank you that always you are ready to listen to the cries of your people, your children." That's his message. And it's his message because he knows that if people are convinced of the faithfulness of God, they will trust him. Right. At this point, Jesus then shouts out loudly, "Lazarus, come out!" And he does. It must be scary. I mean, he looks a bit like a zombie. Not that they ever knew what that word meant, but you do, if you watch the right films. After all, they can't see his hands, they're all bound up in strips of linen. They can't see his feet, they're all bound up in the same way. And they can't see his face, it has a cloth all over it. A scary sight. And Jesus' response is, "Cut him loose." And they do. He's set free. Set him free. So, my friends, in extreme poverty, what have you picked up through the story? Have you picked up that Jesus hears the calls of those who cry to him, his children who cry to him? Have you picked up that if you have belief, faith, trust, you will see the glory of God? Have you picked up the idea of being set free? Have you picked up the idea of all the shackles of poverty being taken away? It is indeed a story which is perfect for those who are in poverty. So, let's go to the second story. The second story is Elisha and a jug of oil. This is another impossible task story. If you look at it, analyze it carefully, it's identical to the feeding of the 5,000. The same sort of pattern or plot is there. Elisha, of course, you remember, was once the apprentice of Elijah. And when Elijah was no more, Elisha took on the job of being God's prophet in the land. And as such, he travels around, and in due course, he meets a widow who's in a desperate situation, a hopeless situation. She explains to the prophet that her husband had taken on a lot of debt at a time when he was quite confident that he could earn the money and pay it back. But unfortunately, he died, and she was left with the debt. And what is more, the man who has lent the money is coming that very afternoon to collect. She hasn't got the money, and she knows that what he is about to do is to take her 2 sons away and sell them to be slaves so that he recoups his money. This is the impossible situation. And even so, she has no money with which to feed herself or her children. So, Elisha, what are you going to do? Well, he asks her, what have you got? What's in your hand? And she says, oh, nothing. And then she stops and she thinks and she says, oh, I've got a small jug of oil. Interesting. Elisha says, do some stock taking. Normally we do stock taking with a company because it's got so much stock, he wants to know what it is, where it is, and how much it's worth in order to put it on the accounts. Elisha is asking her to take stock of what little she has. And the thing that if people are desperately poor and they have one little thing left, they are prone to hang on to it. It is the one thing between them and utter poverty. What have we got? Some oil. She means olive oil. It's used in cooking, it's used in medicine, it's used in lighting lamps. It's very useful. It's a commodity which is often traded. You can turn it to money and back again with ease. So, he says, right, go with your sons down the village and collect as many containers, jugs, basins, whatever, not just a few, as many as you can. In short, he says, let's involve the community in this. Surely as she goes down, people will want to know why she wants all these containers, and she will tell them this is what the prophet has said she should do, and he's helping her get out of this impossible situation. Anyway, together with her boys, she does this. Remember, Elisha has said, not just a few, as many as you can. It's a crucial point. He's believing in the generosity of God. Anyway, they do this. They bring all the containers back to the house, and for some reason they lock the door, and the widow begins to pour the oil from her small jug into the first container until that container is filled. Her son provides the next container, and she continues. And they do this time and time again until when she asks for the next container, her son says, that's it. There are no more containers. And at that moment, the pouring of the oil stops. You see, there is a direct link between the number of containers and how much oil she ends up with. She has to commit the little oil that she has, and the number of containers she got shows the extent of her faith in this whole process. Well, she goes and tells Elijah what has happened, and he says, well, you sell all this oil, and the first demand on the money you get is to pay this moneylender, and the rest of it you keep for yourself and your son. Again, we have this magic divine mathematics. We start with a small amount of oil. We end up with a vast amount of oil, which is enough and more than enough. The process, it seems to me, is always one of stopping in difficult circumstances, when faced with impossible tasks, when in seemingly hopeless situations, and looking very carefully at the true nature of God, what he is truly like. And then looking and thinking about how he feels and cares about us. And then facing those impossible situations, those difficult tasks, and realizing they're not so hopeless or impossible as we might have thought.